Assalamu alaikum students, how are you all? Hope that you are having an amazing day. I'm Muhammad Naeem Amin Bhatti, and today we are going to discuss poets of the Romantic Age. I have decided to divide this study session into lectures. The first lecture will cover the features, characteristics of Romantic poetry, its major subjects, and among the three schools or groups of Romantic poetry we will discuss today the lake poets Wordsworth, Coleridge and Southey in this lecture. But in our second lecture we will discuss the same as the Scott group, Scott, Campbell and Moore, and the younger group Byron, Shelley and Keats, etc. So basically we are going to describe the characteristics of Romantic poetry now. So the very first characteristic or the feature of the Romantic poetry is a love of the unspoiled natural world. That the Romantic poetry deals with the nature and its characteristics. As we can see in the poetry of William Wordsworth, that there is a lot of discussion about the nature in his poetry. The sublime and the beautiful characteristics of the nature are expressed in this poetry. The nature of existence, that the value of the individual, the people who are living in the rural areas as well as in urban areas, the things which belongs to nature, the different features and different existences of the nature are discussed in this Romantic poetry. And if we discuss about some poetic devices in which we can find the imagination, the anaphora, and the alliteration, at the same time we can see the memory or the memorization of different verses and words, and the importance of emotions. Emotion is the fundamental subject matter and characteristic of Romantic poetry, which deals with each and every poet of this era. So that's why the Romanticism was based upon the imagination and emotions also. Now we move towards the major subject matters of Romantic poetry. The Romantic poetry particularly talks about the optimistic sense of renewal, that what are the optimistic thoughts, how to be optimistic about the future life, and the sense of renewal that one day all the disturbance of the life will vanish, and the person will feel happy at last. Interest in the language and life, its major concern is with the different happenings of life. It discusses about the issues of the common people, the feelings, emotions and imagination of the common people of the society at that time. It had a pretty much sort of creativity in it, because the creative mind can generate the vast imagination, the countless imagination through it. It talks about the mysterious things, some kind of the mysteries which reveals to us the life and life events from the past and also from the present. And same is with the synthesis of the human being, the synthesis of emotions of human beings, the synthesis of imaginations of human being. Each and everything is discussed in the form of formation. So the mystery, synthesis and creativity is basically interlinked, because through a quotation I will describe it, that yesterday is a history, tomorrow is a mystery, today is a gift, that's why it's called present. And all these subject matters covers the universality of ideas. Such kind of universality is in the imagination of the poets, and he describes to us with his different verses and poets and poetry and poetic devices. Now we look upon the time frame of the Romantic poetry. The first work of Romantic poetry is considered particularly the lyrical ballads. It was a collaborated work by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth, published in 1798, one of the most famous work of the Romantic era, and that's why the Romantic poetry was considered to be started from 1798 with the collaborative work of St. Coleridge and Wordsworth. Traditionally, it ends with the death of Sir Walter Scott in 1832, though William Wordsworth was alive at that time and he died in 1850. But still, it was covered and it was considered to an end in 1832 because the spirit of romanticism was going to be declined at that time. So here we have a brief sketch of the school of thoughts. There are three major schools of thoughts, or three major groups of poets. The very first group is named as the Lake poets, the second group is named as the Scott group, and the third group is named as the Younger group. The Lake poets included the William Wordsworth from 1770 to 1850, St. Coleridge from 1772 to 1834, Robert Southey 1774 to 1843. This is our topic today, the Lake poets. We will discuss today about the Lake poets, and the other two topics will be covered in the second lecture. The Scott group, Sir Walter Scott 1771 to 1832. Upon his death, the Romanticism spirit was started decline at that time. Thomas Campbell 1774 to 1844, and Thomas More 1779 to 1852. Now if we talk about the Younger group, the poets from this group were died young, in the young age. The very first one is Lord George Gordon Byron from 1788 to 1824. He died at the age of 36 years. P.B. Shelley from 1792 to 1822. He was died in the age of 30 years approximately. And John Keats from 1795 to 1821 was died in the age of 26 years, and he was a man who prophesies his own death in the young age. Now we discuss the Lake poets. What was the terminology used at that time as Lake school or Lake poets was only due to because this generation of poets was belonging with the Lake district. Lake school, the first generation poets, they are also called the first generation poets. Their lives were spent partly in the Lake district. Basically, most of them were writing their poetry at that time and living in the Lake district, linked together by friendship. They all were friends with each other, and they know the subject matters of that time. Like William Wordsworth and St. Coleridge were both friends, and both of them has written the very first book of Romantic period, the lyrical ballads, in 1798. Their revolutionary ideas for youth, they have presented their ideas for youth in the different manner, that they have the idea of the natural thinking in youth. They have given a pacification to the youth and urge to the youth to explore this world through nature. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge together published the lyrical ballads in 1798. We have discussed this point earlier. Now we talk about the William Wordsworth from 1770 to 1850. The poet William Wordsworth was born on April 7, 1770 in Cockermouth, Cumberland, England. He was basically an extraordinary type of genius person. Wordsworth's mother died when he was 7 years old, and he was an orphan at the age of 13 when his father died at that time. So he has faced a number of losses in his life, and after that destructive kind of tragedies in his life, that at the age of 7 his mother died, and at the age of 13 years old, when he was 13 years old, his father died. But he basically did very well at the had concept of nature. There he wrote his first poetry at that time. He went on the study at Cambridge University when he was at the age of 20s. He did well there at the Cambridge University, and because of his continuous and particular imaginative works of poetry, he was excelled there, but managed to graduate in 1791 at the age of 21. Despite of his all of the hurdles in the life, all of the situations, the bad scenarios that he faced in his life, he ultimately did well and started writing his book at that time, which was considered to be an immeasurable type of his his immeasurable type of succession for the lyrical ballads. Wordsworth's preface to the lyrical ballad, I have mentioned it earlier in 1798, that was a collaborated work with the St. Coleridge. He considered a central work of romantic literary theory, the lyrical ballads. He sets forth what he sees as the elements. He basically introduced a new type of poetry at that time in the contemporary English society, that was based on the real language, the language of the poetry, the language of imagination, the language of nature, the language of different type of exaggeration which was required at that time. But he avoids the poetic diction of much 18th century poetry at that time, the poetic diction which was used by different poets at that time in the early 17th and 18th centuries. Wordsworth has a lot of distinctions in his on his credit, that Wordsworth gives his famous definition of poetry. According to Wordsworth, the definition of poetry is that the poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings from emotions recollected in tranquility. He wants to summarize the poetic definition, the definition of poetry in his own words, that it is basically a powerful outlet of feelings and emotions. In 1843, Queen Victoria won crown, and William Wordsworth was crowned as a poet laureate of Great Britain in 1843, and he had this position for 7 years. He did a lot for his country, Great Britain, at that time, and on his death, 1850, he was automatically considered to retire from the poet laureate, or from the position of poet laureate. Now we have a quick look on his major works. The Wordsworth wrote a large number and a variety of lyrics. The song like composition, which can be sing like a song on the symphonies and on the melodies. He written the Lucy poems, also the Cuckoo, the Solitary Reaper, Daffodils. You might have studied this poem in your previous classes, especially in matriculation. Beside the lyrics, the Wordsworth wrote a number of sonnets of rare merit, that the sonnets were covering a large subject matter. To Milton, Westminster's Bridge, the world is too much with us, fine combination of the dignity of the thought and language. Basically, there was a continuous connection between the thought and language in his poetry, in his odes as ode to duty, and ode on the intimations of immortality. These are the basically odes which belong to innumerable of thoughts and ideas from his mind, and he has delivered the imagination at its peak, at its best level of poetry. He gives expression to his high ideals and philosophy of life. According to him, the philosophy of life was all about the nature. He considered the nature as companion, he considered the nature as the teacher, he considered the nature as preacher, he considered the nature as nurse and as a soothing agent. According to him, the nature has a large definition. So that is his philosophy of life also. He says that the human being never died, but basically they go for the rest in the lap of nature. Wordsworth as a poet of nature, the poet of man, the poet of human life. I have described to you his concept of nature. He is considered as poet of nature. In his youth, he came under the influence of French Revolution, that was all about the changing parameter of that time of society. And according to Wordsworth, the man is a part of nature. As I have mentioned earlier, that according to him, we never die, but we always take a rest in the lap of nature. In poem The Resolution and Independence, he makes a single picture of the nature and also the French Revolution also. Wordsworth's greatest nature poems are the line composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey and the yew trees and the Simplon Pass. These poems describes to us the true natural gifts, and also in the Lucy poems and Daffodils he has also described the counterpart of nature which is too much of with us. And Wordsworth considered the nature as a soothing agent and nurse also. Now we talk about his longer poems. He has written the short poems in a number of time, in a number of ways, but his long poem was the Prelude, which is considered as one of his remarkable works. The Prelude was basically the a type of longer poem consisting much that is prosy and uninteresting type, but still it has gained the attention of reader even in nowadays and also in that time. The greatest part of his work, including the prelude and the exuration, was basically intended for a place as in a single great poem to be called the Recluse. So the which treats the subject of the nature, the man and society in a long narrative way. The prelude treating the growth of the poet's mind was to introduce this work. The Excursion was basically written in 1814 and it is the second book of the Recluse, and also the third book of this Recluse series was never completed until he was died. So basically we elaborate the Recluse as it was basically a series of the books that he has written, and first book of his series Recluse was the Prelude, the second one was the Excursion, and the third was the book that he was writing in his life, but he was died and it was never completed by him. His important quotes are here on your screen, that the best portion of a good man's life is little nameless unremembered acts of kindness and love. In these lines he talk about the good nature, the kindness, the love, and unnumberable acts of kindness. The second one is that fill your paper with the breathing of your heart. And similarly, wisdom is often times nearer when we stoop. Though nothing can bring back the hour we wandered lonely, I wandered lonely as a cloud. This is a famous line from the Daffodils, the very first line of Daffodils, which is the poem and dealing with the nature. Nature was source of all joy for Wordsworth, and nature for him was a living personality, just like a teacher, a guardian, and a nurse. We have discussed it earlier in our this lecture. So after discussing the William Wordsworth, we quickly move towards the Samuel Taylor Coleridge, St. Coleridge from 1772 to 1834. Was born on 21st October 1772. He was the youngest of 14 children. He was educated after his father's death. So exactly like the Wordsworth, he was also an orphan in early age. He attended the Christ's Hospital and Jesus College, and he often wrote poetry. His talent did not manifest until after 1794, when he transitioned into what would late be described as the Romantic poetry. So the reason behind is that he was writing poetry at that time, but there was a lack of guidance in his poetry, that he was not properly a guided poet at that time. But when he met with William Wordsworth, he come to know the true meaning of poetry, and he guided Wordsworth, and Wordsworth also guided him. So that's why they have a collaborated work in the form of lyrical ballads. So that is a very famous poem of the Romantic poetry, the famous book of the Romantic poetry. Some critics says that St. Coleridge was a half poet and half madman. He's called madman because he exaggerated the very first subject matter of the poetry to, and he elevated it to the upper level. And like his in his poem, the Kubla Khan, he gives us the imagination up to such an extent that he has built a glass dome. He has built a dome of his palace, and there is an Abbasid doshe, an Abbasid women in Urdu that is called an Abbasid doshiza. She was dancing and singing on the flute, and this poem was composed in his dream, and it was also an incomplete poem. So that's why he is called the half poet and half madman. And some of the critics about him says that he was also an opium eater. He often used to smoke opium, or to use to indulge with the opium addiction. He was an addicted to opium drug. So we talk about the poetry of Coleridge. Though most of the poems in the lyrical ballads were written by Wordsworth, but Coleridge contributed in the four poems. The very first one is one of his most famous, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Basically discuss the story of a mariner who was on a sea voyage and come across the bad tempers. You have read about the poem Water, water everywhere, water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. So this famous line has been taken from the rhyme of ancient mariner, who used to tell the people about the story of his curse that was by God on him. Water, water everywhere, water, water everywhere, and all the boats did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. He gives us the concept of the painted ocean, like the painted ship, and the bloody sun at noon. These are the famous lines from the rhyme of the ancient mariner. Coleridge, as a supernatural poet, he talk about the supernatural natural powers, the powers which are beyond the natural world. If Wordsworth has uplift the poetry from common level to the natural level, then Coleridge has uplifted this poetry from natural level towards the supernatural level. That is some type of poetry which relates with the metaphysical poetry which we have discussed in the previous semesters. So Coleridge, as a supernatural poet, was basically at a time, as a, you can say that as a poet was writing the natural poetry poetry in an exaggerated way. So this poetry by the Coleridge was pretty much concerned with the aesthetic players at that time, the aesthetic sense. And in Urdu we can say it as the hisse jamaliyat, like zauke jamaliyat, the something which deals with the aesthetic players, or that is also called the liberating aesthetic. Poetry should express in a genuine language, experience, etc. There is a lot of emotions and imaginations in an exaggerated way in his poetry. The truest experience is to be found in the nature, but not only in the nature but also in the supernatural manners. But there is a balance between the poet's influence and the real language. He makes it in a very balanced way, balance between the commonplace and the supernatural thoughts, that not all the ideas deals with the supernatural thought, but he has also discussed the common ideas as well. If we talk about the stream of his works, the poetic expression to his political aspirations in the religious way, he written The Destiny of Nations and Ode to the Departing Year 1796, which is considered to be an important year in Coleridge's life. After that, he started writing his one of the most famous book, The Lyrical Ballad, a collaborated work with the Wordsworth. But like Wordsworth, he also began to think differently after the excess of the French Revolution. So the French Revolution has given a type of influence on both of these poets and a number of poets from the Romantic age. This change of thought is shown in his beautiful poem France, because the French Revolution was started in France also, so that's why he has written France, relating it to the French Revolution. The ode, an ode 1798, which he himself called his recantation, and after that, like Wordsworth, supported the conservative cause. The Ancient Mariner and Christabel are his famous poems. Coleridge was a man of gigantic genius. He was a madman, and madness is itself a form of geniusness according to Shakespeare. So I can agree with this idea that he was as well as a genius, a poet, and a madman also. But his lack of willpower and basically the addiction to opium, as I have mentioned earlier, he was called an opium eater also by several, and number of as a several critics has called him. He prevented him from the realm of poetry. Two great poems, The Ancient Mariner and Christabel, are famous of his poems, poetry, and Coleridge saved the supernaturalism, sensationalism, and psychological truth in all of his poetry. He will talk about his perception of mysteries that surrounded the commonplace things in everyday life. He has given us the different perception point of views and different mysterious point of views in his poetry, like in the rhyme to the Ancient Mariner and the Christabel. His other famous works are Kubla Khan, that I have described to you, that was written in dreamlike in a dreamlike situation. He has written that there is a huge palace that was built up by Kubla Khan, and in that palace there were a number of trees of the fruits and the canals in which the milk and honey and even the alcohol was flowing at that time, and there was a woman in that palace who was singing and dancing at the flutes and on the musical instruments. So that was an exaggerated form of supernaturalism. He has written Love, The Dark Lady, Youth and Age, Dejection and Ode. His number of poems full of very minute description of the natural scenes, yet his strength lay in his marvelous dream faculty and his reputation as a poet rest on the Ancient Mariner, Christabel, and Kubla Khan, where he touches the heights of romantic traditions. Now we talk about Robert Southey from 1774 to 1843. He was the third poet of the group of lake poets. He was a little bit of different from Wordsworth and Coleridge. He lacked the higher qualities of poetry, but still he was gripped with his poetry at that time, the subject matters and the themes also. His achievement as a poet is not much. He has written the Thalaba and the Curse of Kehma. Modak and Roderick are based on the mythology of different nations. Some distinctions of Southey are here. He also wrote a number of ballads and short poems, of which the best known is about his love for books. My days among the dead are past. But he wrote far better prose than the poetry. His prose was much better than the poetry. His admirable Life of Nelson remains a classic. He was made the poet laureate in 1813, and he was basically a type of poet who was not much famous due to his works, but he was only famous due to his position as a poet laureate. After his death in 1843, he remained at that position with a time span of 30 years, and after his death in 1843, Wordsworth held this title as a poet laureate. So that's end with the discussion today. There are some references if you want to some further study readings or the guidance from the books. You have the references on your screen. So that's it from my today's lecture. Hope that you have understood all the essential concepts and all the points that I mentioned to you. So stay home, stay safe. It's goodbye from me.